I just came to this university, in fact, the other day to talk about mythology to the drama students at NIDA, and I brought with me a version I did of Hippolytus, and there's a moment at the end of that where Hippolytus has been exiled by Theseus, and he goes out in his chariot, and Theseus calls in an old debt that is owed to him by Poseidon, the god of the sea, and he says, I'm calling in this debt now, get him. And Hippolytus is going along the shore, and suddenly, and we get all this in a description by an eyewitness, he looks out at sea, to sea, and he sees this enormous wave coming, which is described as kind of bulls charging. And the horses panic, and the wave takes the chariot and completely destroys it. Now, that is an absolutely precise scientific description of a tsunami at work after an underwater eruption. So, what the Greeks were doing is they were looking at those things, and instead of explaining them only in a scientific way, they would mythologize them so they become a piece of action, and the sea is an active figure in terms of Poseidon. They do that also for almost all psychological states, for greed, for lust, for whatever it is. Don't want to go into all of that. But just as we have found a kind of mythologizing of all of that in psychology, and in psychoanalysis and also Freudian, Jungian stuff, that's how the Greeks did it. So the religion that they've got is a way of embodying in non-abstract ways the human forces inside humans and forces inside the universe that you're dealing with. And to that's one of the reasons why, if you read the Iliad, almost all the action concerning the gods is comic. They can be comic figures. They don't have to be taken all that seriously. They kind of know that what they are is really objectifications of human folly and confusion. So it seemed to me that you could include the gods here if you offered them as a way of seeing something that was purely psychological. So, particularly when Iris turns up to Priam, he doesn't actually see Iris. He sees a vanishing iridescence, which is the hem of her garment, and he decides that what he has just dreamt or thought up has been dictated to him by Iris. It's a bit different with the Hermes character because he really is a kind of, and he belongs to the comic world of that journey, really. He's a kind of, he's a cheeky kind of figure, but he's also a piece of cheek on the part of the writer. Really that thing of saying, if you believe this, you'll believe anything, but I'm going to convince you.
Yeah. But the fact that Iris talks about chance opens the way for this very moving account of Priam's capture and rescue by Hesione, his sister. And it's really he's standing at a crossroads at that moment, isn't he? He's at a crossroads. His life could have been entirely different with just and so in a sense that is so tremendously powerful because it gives flesh to that abstract.
Yeah, but look, the other thing that all of that does is, and it goes back to something you were saying earlier about the poetic quality of the writing. Look, the thing that I've always been interested in, more than anything in fiction, is what's going on in people's heads. The books are almost entirely about people's inner lives, not about action at all. And almost all of my books have been taken out as film options, and that's great because they pay for that. Yeah. But you really keep, every time anybody comes to you with one of those, you say, "Are you serious? If you looked at this book, nothing happens." It all takes place in someone's head. And if there's a scene between two characters, they're both sitting there saying nothing, and you're being told what they're thinking. And And it's because the writing is very visual, which is another thing, that people are misled into believing that you could make a film of this. So one of the things that I'm interested, one of the things why I went to all that material about Priam is because what I was able to do was something that Homer certainly wouldn't do and doesn't do, which is to provide this man with a whole inner life and a whole set of inner confusions and memories. I mean, he's like several characters in my books. That becomes for him not a choice that was made, but an alternative life that he's not living, which is a kind of ghost life which he has always been living, and which undermines deeply his sense of his own integrity in a kind of way. Now, that will never happen in Homer, but that story allowed me to do that with him, and that's kind of what I'm more interested in than pure action.
Sure, yeah. Well, one of the things, of course, that's really striking about Priam then is that he visualises the whole thing, the cart and going down, as though it's already happened, and he knows that is what he's going to do. And so it's not just the inner life, it's the power of the imagination, and this is where the power of the novel comes in, because he imagines, and what is imagined then can be achieved. And this can be done in words. I just want to read a little passage, if I could, where Hecuba gets extremely anxious about what he's doing. And he says, we have the opportunity to act for ourselves, to try a different course. She wishes she had misheard. Words are powerful. They too can be the agents of what is new, of what is conceivable, and can be thought and let loose upon the world. And that seems to me exactly the power of the novel, to imagine what could be. And that's why the story has such purchase, because it is the power of the imagination. And it's very interesting, because how does that fit in then with your desire to give the minutiae, the irrelevancies of ordinary life? You've got this huge power of the imagination. It seems to me that sets Priam on a journey that...
the imagination is one thing, but you see, one of the other things that the novel does is it takes a lot of time about observing the way the world is. And it's a lot of the interest of the novel. It's not description, it's rendering the specificity and density of the world we're in. And one of the things, Priam has never had any real experience of that. And one of the things that journey provides him with is the possibility of experiencing all of that firsthand. And a lot of that's what that section is about. He also has the ideal companion, because he's got a companion who has lived with that all his life and knows nothing else. And so everything that for Somax is just ordinary life is for Priam a kind of revelation, because he's never looked at any of those things. And what he realizes is that almost everything he is seeing and hearing, in terms of his previous life, has no use. It's got interest, but it's got no use. And that's partly what the irrelevancy is that the novel has, I think, always been interested in.
Yeah. So Somax is the cart driver whose donkey cart takes Priam down to Achilles with all the treasure. And he's a complete invention of yours. How did you come up with him? Or why? Because
Look,
I think...
One morning when I was sitting fiddling around with all of this, the idea for him came to me. I couldn't tell you when or how or why. What working really as a writer largely is about is sitting down and not knowing what you're doing or where something is going, and having something happen. And, each morning when you set yourself down to it, usually without any fixed idea of where the book is now going, you're hoping that one of those things is going to happen. And, one of those times, I would have said, what if?
I think it's a stroke of genius because what Somax does is shift the whole centre of gravity of the novel away from Priam and Achilles to Priam's transformation from this almost godlike king to a person who can actually experience the real world, and it's the novel's capacity to give flesh to that real world that's really so powerful. And so that middle section of the 5 chapters is really the centre, the moral and structural centre, because it's Priam's transformation. And it seems to me, again, this is the sort of allegory of the novel itself, allowing you to experience real life, the minutiae of life, and how powerful and extraordinary that is. And he'd never actually thought about the fact that these little griddle cakes, required certain kinds of ingredients and a way of making them. It's just, it's a brilliant demonstration of a man coming into contact with the ordinary life. I think it seems to me something that the novel does brilliantly, and it's much more than, well, it is what's going on inside him, and nothing much happens in that whole section, but there's a huge transformation.
Well, he's kind of, it seems to me, ready for that, because he's already sort of thinking that his whole life, that whole stance he has as king, is like he thinks of his real self as being kind of rattling around like a pea in a golden shell sort of thing. So he's already half prepared when he goes out there as something that he is fearful of, that adventure is going to be something that either makes or breaks him and will reveal something to him. He also, he's also understands, well, first of all, he's trying to retell his own story. He's trying to make quite certain. See, he knows that the story that's going to happen and that will be told of him is that Troy falls, he is killed, dragged out into the streets and torn to pieces by dogs. And he does not want that to be the last thing we remember of him. So if that's not going to happen, and everybody in this world is concerned about the story that will be told about them, he has to do something so extraordinary that what he's done will replace his death as the thing that is told about him. And so, he's got something invested in all of that. But he also has some kind of idea that if he can bring off what he wants to bring off, which is going to Achilles just as a man and a father, that somehow he will be offering Achilles, and that's what we're concerned with too, the way of breaking out of his own trap that he's caught in. So I think somewhere in the book, the idea is put forward by Priam that the real ransom that he's taking to Achilles is the possibility of doing something also that is unprecedented and that will free him. So, a lot of the book is about redemption.
Yeah. Yes. Well, there's this line, he has stepped into a space that till now was uninhabited and has found a way to fill it. And I think it's a perfect description of what he's done. But in the process, there's something else. That's extremely important. And again, it's part of what Priam's transformation is about. And if I could just read this, and this section where he's really overwhelmed in a way by Somax's life and by the ordinary. He says, it was as if you had found yourself peering through the crack in a door. Exciting, Prohm found, this imagining himself into a situation he would never have dreamed of acting out, and saw clearly for a moment into the fellow's life, his world, the world of the daughter-in-law too. And, yet again, we see this is the power of words, the power of the imagination, the power of the novel to do this. So in a sense, Prohm's transformation is a confirmation of what can be achieved through the power of story, but not just the power of story, the ability to give flesh to the ordinary.
That image of peering through a door and what you grasp is something that I do go back to, I must say. I think all writers, little writers in the making, and I've said this often, become very, very, very expert eavesdroppers and voyeurs. And I spent an awful lot of my time in that first house I lived in at 12 Edmondson Street, hiding behind doors and listening and peering at things. But all children do it, because how else are they ever going to discover what's going on? I mean, your parents are never going to tell you what's going on. But I think there are some people who become very, very expert at it, and all writers do. And, almost everything that a writer uses as material is something that he picks up either by eavesdropping or peering through cracks in doors. So, and I've said again, it's in that essay that I wrote recently on experience. That threshold experience is a really, really important one. There's a wonderful quotation that Henry James has about a woman novelist who gets praised for the fact that she writes a book. I don't know who it is. It could be George Eliot. Writes a book about a Protestant family in France. And people say to her, how on earth did you get to understand the workings of that world? You must have spent an awful lot of time observing or listening. And she says, no, once in a hotel, I was going up some stairs and a door was ajar, and through it I glimpsed a French Protestant family at supper. And that's what you need. That's what a writer can take and grab and run with. But it's almost always a sort of threshold experience, something glimpsed through a door. So, I mean, that partly explains that image.
No, that's very interesting. I mean, there's this very interesting combination of the imagination and the power of words and the ordinary. I remember you saying once that the things that you write are absolutely real at the time you're writing them. And would that be true for this book as well?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that I think writers are really, really naive in the same way that children are, and that when you're writing, doesn't matter how, and I'm sure this is true of science fiction writers or anybody. Doesn't matter how improbable it is, if you're fully imagining it, then you're there and it's happening. Partly that thing you just said is, when I wrote Jono, I used to still go around to schools a bit, and people used to always say to me about some section in the book, did this really happen? And it was true. What I found myself saying as the simplest truth of all of that was, well, yes, it happened while I was writing it, because I couldn't remember any longer what was real and what I had imagined and put in the book. And that's good, because it tells you that the book is seamless in some kind of way.
Great. Achilles too, we've sort of left him out a bit, but because I think really the centre of the novel is Prohm's transformation, but Achilles too has a glimpse of through a door, doesn't he? When he sees the women preparing Hector's body, and it's the life of the hero suddenly has margins, and he can see beyond that. It's a sort of threshold experience for him. And
yeah, that's great. That was very interesting to me, because there are women in the Iliad. Priam treats Helen absolutely impeccably, with the greatest possible courtesy. And the scenes between Hector and Andromache as domestic scenes are wonderfully written and observed and very, very human. And but it seemed to me that there's another way in which women must be there but are never mentioned in those things. And that laying out and the place where the washing gets done seemed to me to be another place where you could open up a bit of the Iliad which is not there and do something in the crack.
Yeah. I wonder if, I just might finish with a criticism from a reviewer which you might respond to. And, this fellow says, Ransom disappoints because it's neither humble enough nor brash enough when it takes Homer on. It falls between the two stools, neither true enough to Homer nor sufficiently untrue to him. I wonder how you'd respond. You might want to just say bugger off,
I just think you just have to say, every reader will respond in their own kind of way. And if you've written something that every reader kind of responded to in the same way, there'd be something wrong with it. Look, it's quite interesting. To me, just looking at the reviews, there are hardly any reviews of that kind in Australia. One slightly. It was quite a common response to the book in England. Not, again, in America, which is quite interesting to me. And it's got something to do, I think, with people's attitude to writing or to literature or something.
Or who owns high culture.
I was going to say, it's got a lot to do with who owns... Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
David, I wonder if you'd read a little bit for us now.
Look, what I usually end up reading at these things is a bit right from the end, because one of the things that happens at the end is the kind of only survivor here is Somax. And so he becomes like a kind of Homer, because he's telling as a story the little bit that he's experienced of all of this. So it's sort of, it's however many centuries it is before Homer and the other people have got round to doing it, but he becomes the first storyteller of any of this kind of material. And all he's doing is telling the bit of it that he knows. In the early days, while Troy still stands solid and gleaming on its high hill, the figures he has to speak of, Priam, Hecuba, Achilles, will still, in the minds of his listeners, be sharers of their own world, creatures like themselves of flesh and blood. Later, when Troy has become just another long, windswept hilltop, its towers reduced to rubble, its citizens scattered or carried off like Hecuba and Hector's wife Andromache and Cassandra and the other Trojan women into exile and slavery, all he has to tell, which was once as real as the itch under his tunic and the licy cracks between his nails, will have become the stuff of legend, half folktale, half an old man's empty bragging. So many stories. He tells them to anyone who will share a drink with him. On summer evenings under the big misshapen sycamore at the tavern door, nodding off at times in mid-sentence so that his listeners creep away smiling and shake their heads, or by the light of a single oil lamp and with a young one on his lap, one of his many great-grandchildren, on long nights when the entire village is holed up against invaders behind the doors of the fortified barn. Those who sit intent as children and give themselves up to these old tales will have heard them 100 times before and know every detail and unlikely turn. The meeting in the tamarisk grove with the impudent fellow who was in fact the god Hermes in the guise of an Achaean warrior, a dandified youth with golden tresses and a scent, it was this that gave him away, like gilly flowers. How in a quiet spot beyond the same tamarisk grove, he had managed without too much trouble to tempt the old king Priam, who had never heard of such a thing, to cool his feet in the running stream and taste one of the little griddle cakes his daughter-in-law was such a dab hand at. How he had spent the night in the open yard beside Achilles' hut in the Greek camp and was given gobbets of meat to eat that the great Achilles himself had sliced and roasted, with scallions and the finest wheaten bread to soak up the grease, and had slept very comfortably afterwards under a lamb's wool rug provided one of Achilles' squires. His listeners do not believe him, of course. He is a known liar. He is 100 years old and drinks too much. What he has to tell did happen, or so they say, but to someone else. Idaeus the man was called, King Priam's herald. Is it likely that such a figure, a king's herald, would have griddle cakes in his satchel? Do great kings dabble their feet in icy streams? This old fellow, like most storytellers, is a stealer of other men's tales, of other men's lives.
Thank you very much.